Hi, and welcome to Lifestyle Management. Here we are in part two of Healthy Aging. Now, regardless of what good and healthy things that we're doing, we're still all going to pass away. And I'm not trying to be a negative. It's just the reality. Nobody lives forever. So, as we age, there are many things to address and to deal with, and we're going to look at some of these issues, including mental health issues like depression, driving risks, substance misuse and abuse, and of course, coping with grieving and loss of friends and family. We'll start with depression. It's estimated that seniors are among the most undertreated population for mental health, with depression in more than 1/3 of people ages 65 and older going undetected. Now, that would suggest that people over 65 who were going through what we would normally see in someone younger and calling it depression is being seen as just something normal, everyday way that as people age that happens to them. But it's not. Depression is depression, whether you're 18, 30, or 80. Depression is a serious problem among the elderly, and they may face additional challenges, including declining health, the loss of a loved one, social isolation, and physical limitations. Depressed older adults are as likely to benefit from medication as younger individuals. A significant issue, however, is the taking of medications correctly. 20% of hospital visits are due to side effects of medication taken incorrectly among 65 and older. Another challenge for older adults is driving risks. We've probably all pointed to someone in a car thinking, what are they doing driving? They're too old. In 2017, Canadians over the age of 65 had higher fatality rates, 18%, than any other age group, except young drivers 25 to 34. They were at 18.9%. Driving problems faced by older adults involve visual, cognitive, and motor skills, which may decline with age. Medications are a factor when driving, especially for older adults. Older adults need to get retested for driving, and I think that's about every year after, or every 2 years after the age of 80. What about smoking? Is it ever too late to quit smoking? Well, some research suggests that older smokers are more likely to be hardcore smokers. No kidding, eh? Heavy smokers who expected never to quit, the sooner the smoker stops using tobacco, the greater their health benefits at any age. Of course, that's easier said than done. If any one of us knows someone who's over 65 and still smoking, you can ask them about quitting smoking, and you might hear why they don't. I'm too old. I've been doing this all my life. It's not easy to get to the point where you might get some or gain some benefit. COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, is a lung disorder caused by smoking. Now, next, we'll consider substance misuse and abuse. Now, misuse and abuse of prescription and over-the-counter medications occur frequently among the elderly. The most commonly used drug are sleeping pills, tranquilizers, pain medication, and laxatives. As there's problems with remembering, concentration, and thinking, which are the most common side effects of drugs in the elderly. Even some of them going through different experiences of dementia and Alzheimer's. There are different techniques and strategies to use to help people take their medications in a timely manner. My dad is 90 years old and in a long-term care facility, and a few years ago he had difficulty taking medications when he was supposed to take them. If missed, he kind of thought, well, I'll just double up or triple up so I can get caught up. The medication, because you've missed them, but there is different technologies. That's not a healthy approach. And so there are dosets, medication dosets that can be dispensing meds and only making the med available for a certain time is the only med you have access to. So there are other strategies in place that help with this now. Another one of the other problems, of course, you might expect is alcohol. It can make mental confusion much more confusing and memory problems much worse. Surveys have found an increased prevalence of alcohol and alcoholism among older adults. We consider several issues and factors that older people can affect themselves just aging. We will now going to turn our heads towards neglect and abuse of older adults by others. Now, by definition, neglect is an intentional failure by a family member or caregiver to provide required support to an older adult. Elder abuse is a form of neglect. It is defined as an action against an older adult that causes harm or suffering. And we'll touch on 3 forms of neglect and abuse. And the one that's sort of surprising, but it's the number one, is financial abuse of older adults. And this is one of the most common forms of abuse. This includes the misuse of the older adult's money, not spending it on their own needs, spending it on yourself, for example, pressuring them for money or possessions, and forcing will changes. Older adults can be very vulnerable. Secondly, physical and sexual abuse of older adults. This can include hitting, shaking, pushing, to sexual touching and activity without consent. In 2017, 63% of older adults experiencing family violence. 44 of those suffered from family violence sustained an injury. And then thirdly, psychological and emotional abuse of older adults. Verbal and nonverbal intimidation and the compromising of their psychological well-being are included here. Can be a family member, a caregiver, or the general public. Now, one symptom of aging, particularly if any of the neglect or abuse happens, is isolation. Isolation is a feeling of not being connected to others. Now, this is made worse by infrequent social contacts. Social isolation within the Indigenous seniors, there are some protections and vulnerabilities regarding socialization of Indigenous adults. There is a strong sense of community and support and caregiving of one another. However, many older adults still need to leave their home areas to receive medical or healthcare needs and supports, thus creating a sense of isolation for them. Added to this are continued issues of economic and social circumstances and food insecurities. We can continue on with this sort of isolation bit and look at social isolation of the LGBTQ seniors. And for the LGBTQ seniors, living alone, loss of social networks, friends, partners passing away, and the continued fear of discrimination and stigmatization can make growing old very isolating. As you can imagine, aging is not for the faint of heart. It can be very trying. So next, here's something that might be surprising to you and may be encouraging to you. Is sexuality in aging? A study based on some 3,005 participants found that older adults between the ages of 57 and 85, yep, you heard me correctly, 85, aging does cause some changes in sexual response. Women produce less vaginal lubrication. Men need more time to achieve an erection or orgasm and to attain another erection or ejaculation. But none of these changes reduce the pleasure or the sexual desire. So the tip here is, if you have older parents or grandparents, you might want to be making sure before you visit you phone to say you're coming over, just to be sure. So let's look at whether or not, or how older Canadian adults are using digital technology. Canada's older adults have embraced technology and are the fastest growing group users of the internet. That might surprise you unless you're on Facebook and your grandma or your mom has asked to be your friend on Facebook. That might be a little uncomfortable. It might not be. In a study of online activities of Canadian seniors, the technology is helping the seniors, that is, they think technology is helping them live their lives on their own and to live their lives on their own longer. Seniors use email to keep in contact with others. Social network sites like Facebook are being used. Skype and FaceTime help seniors keep in touch with family and friends. One of the big benefits, or at least the things that people can do as they get older, is helps them stay happy and healthier longer, is the social networking. A recent study indicated that older people who acknowledge the importance of the internet tend to be satisfied using it as a leisure activity. Okay, now the last section is often treated or regarded as a taboo, and we don't talk about death and dying. We're going to talk about it here for a bit. Now, the first little thing we're going, to chat on is defining death. And I know it seems pretty obvious. You die, you're dead. In our society, death isn't part of life like it once was. Death has been broken down into the following categories. We have functional death, cellular death, cardiac death, brain death, and spiritual death. Now, you'll find these in your textbook, but it gives you some sense that the different reasons that satisfy different criteria, we have different definitions for death. What if you're denying death? What if you deny death? What will happen? And this is something that takes place for some seniors and for some people who look after seniors. A reasonable amount of denial helps us focus on the day-to-day realities of living. However, excessive denial can be life-threatening. As a person gets older, their denial of their own mortality can be an issue. Now, sometimes that just helps them to get on with the day-to-day activities. That day is going to come regardless. That day that I'm going to die is going to come irregardless of what I do. But to deny to the point that you don't look after yourself can be a problem. So there's an emotional response to dying. And of course there would be. Actually, there are well-established stages, if you will. There are 5 typical stages of reaction that a person goes through when facing death. And this was work that was established through Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She did an awful lot of research into this area, and she created the 5 stages of adjustment to death. The first stage is what's known as denial. Nope, not me. At first knowledge that death is coming, a terminally ill person usually will reject the news. Stage 2 is anger. Why me? The dying person begins to feel resentment and rage regarding the imminent death. Third, we're going to bargain. Yes, me, but. A patient may try to bargain, usually with their God or their personal spiritual deity for a way to reverse or at least postpone dying. The fourth stage, depression. Yes, it's me. Now, this is not clinical depression like a psychological disorder. The patient gradually realizes the full consequences of his or her condition and begins to grieve. And then the fifth stage is acceptance. Yes, me. And I'm ready. The person accepts the reality of death. Now, several stages may occur at the same time, and some may even happen out of sequence. However, we get to a point where we are aware of our own mortality, and perhaps earlier than this would be best to do what we call preparing for our death. Now, you can make some decisions about your end of life. You can make these decisions yourself. For example, would I prefer to receive or refuse any specific treatment? If I were unconscious and incapable of voicing my own opinion, these are questions that we ought to think about, because we can have an influence on how we are treated when we're not able to make these decisions ourselves. Would I like my body systems to be kept functioning by extraordinary life-sustaining measures, even though my natural systems have failed? If I could not survive without medical assistance, would I want to be kept alive or resuscitated? If my heart were to stop, and we don't always think about this, but these are the things that we need to prepare, we need to think about, because they are documents we can sign to make sure that what we want happens. Would have liked the province, otherwise, if you don't set your own circumstances, would you like the province to decide how to distribute your property, or would I prefer to name the recipients of my estate? How would you like to decide how to handle your funeral arrangements? Lots of questions. And here's where we can introduce advance directives, a living will, and our wills. Let's look at these. What's an advanced directive? Well, these are used to specifically, or they're specific, the kind of medical treatment individuals want in case of medical crisis. A healthcare proxy is an advance directive that gives someone else the power to make decisions on your behalf. A do not resuscitate, a DNR. That's a directive that indicates that you do not want to be resuscitated in case that your heart stops beating. All right? Your inevitable demise occurs, you pass away. Do you have a will? Well, a living will? What is a living will? A living will is not just for people who don't want to be kept alive by artificial means. It can be used to indicate that they want all possible medical treatment and technology to prolong their lives. A will, a living will, is about how to prolong or keep you living. Now, a will, this is different. This is a formal will, typed document prepared by a lawyer or a notary and signed by you in front of at least two witnesses who cannot be your beneficiary or your spouse. There are other techniques used in other provinces. In Quebec, for example, and perhaps other places in the world, the holographic will is prepared in your handwriting, so it's not typed, and it's signed by you with no witnesses necessary. It's important that you specify who you wish to raise your children, should you have property, make these decisions if you die. Without a will, the state, in our case in Canada, the state would be federal or provincial, will make these decisions for you, and it may not benefit the people you would want to see benefited. Now, within aging and getting older, another very difficult issue, and that is suicide. Suicide among elderly is a danger that often goes unnoticed. One of the main factors leading to suicide and illness, especially terminal illness, there is what's known as a rational suicide. Advocates of the right to self-deliverance argue that individuals in great pain are faced with prospects of debilitating and hopeless battle against an incurable disease can and should be able to end their own lives. Many mental health professionals argue that what makes a patient with severe illness suicidal is depression, not their physical condition. However, June 16, 2016, the Federal Ministers of Health and Justice tabled legislation for the medical assistance in dying, MAID or MAID. You notice the term used, doctor-assisted death, not doctor-assisted suicide. There were certainly a lot of controversy around doctors and their roles in sustaining life, not to bring death. Some groups were calling it doctor-assisted suicide, or that it shouldn't be doing, or that you shouldn't be doing this. The bill was legislated and regulated doctor-assisted dying nonetheless, and it happened on as I said, June 16th, 2016. There are two types of MAID. Both means involve a doctor or nurse practitioner. First, there's the medical professionals administer drug causing death, and the second type is a prescription for a drug that is self-administered. It will be interesting going forward where this goes and how it affects other people who may not have the same sort of condition that this bill is targeting. Lastly, is grief and grieving. Death of loved one may be a single most upsetting and feared event in a person's life. Grieving may continue for many years and for many people. What are some of the effects that grieving might have in your health? Men and women who lose partners, parents, or children sometimes endure very much stress, that they are at an increased risk of physical and mental illness, and even their own premature death. Now, of course, there are more methods, different ways that people mourn and grieve, and it is a psychological necessity, not self-indulgent, and that's an important distinction. Grief isn't something that you're doing to bother anybody or to just make yourself feel bad. It's psychologically necessity. Only by working through grief, dealing with feelings and anger and despair, and adjusting emotionally and intellectually to the loss, can a bereaved individual make their way back to the living world with hope and with love. So how can you help survivors of loss? Family and friends must take initiative to spend time with those who are mourning the loss of a loved one. Most bereaved people don't need professional psychological counseling. In most instances, sharing their feelings with friends is all it's needed. If someone is moving through grief and it's taking a much longer time, perhaps pursuing some professional support would be really helpful. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope it hasn't been too unsettling. Like I said, we don't all get out alive, so learning about and preparing for our own mortality is an important, and is having this conversation ought to be more fluid and more open and maybe not so difficult. The more we talk about it, the more maybe we'll be comfortable with how to be helpful and supportive and not so afraid. I hope this has been very helpful, and good luck and carry on the good fight, everyone. Bye now.